Didn't anyone tell you should not sneak up on people like that? Don't worry about it. I've had my fair share of scares. While I got you here, do you believe in folklore? If you do, you may be very wise. Are they legends? Or are they just simply stories told to keep us safe? One man I know asked this question, and he ventured into the jungles of Australia, into the bushes deep near the billabongs, and he came face to face with just what he wanted to find out. Stay with me, and I'm going to read you from the stories in the pages of darkness. Let's begin.
They say it lives where the water runs still, where the reeds whisper secrets no one should hear. The elders called it the Bunyip, the water spirit with teeth like stone and eyes like fire. They warned us, never linger by the billabong after dark, but I, stubborn, sceptical fool that I am, wanted to see it for myself. Hi, my name is George Allen. I was always interested in things that were considered folklore and how stories were used to keep people safe from danger. And recently, a young man had gone missing in these parts. Well, folklore started to grip the people of the area, so I decided to let logic rule the day and prove that folklore was, well, simply that, folklore. The moon hung low that night, its silver light barely cutting through the mist that clung to the gum trees in a shroud. My guide, John Owen, an old man with skin weathered like the land itself, spat into the dirt as we approached the edge of the billabong. "You're mad, you know, Georgie," he muttered, his voice gruff and tinged with a heavy accent. "This place ain't for us, not at night." I smiled, trying to hide my unease. "It's just a story, John. A myth to scare children." John turned sharply, his dark eyes narrowing. "It's more than a story. My grandfather saw it. Watched his brother dragged under the water screaming. Next morning, the billabong was red as ochre." He leaned in close, his breath hot and sour. "It doesn't just kill you, mate. It keeps you." His words lingered as I set up camp. He refused to stay, muttering curses under his breath as he vanished into the trees. I shrugged it off, telling myself that fear bred folklore, and folklore bred superstition. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the world cloaked in shadows, I couldn't shake the feeling that something old, something hungry was watching me. The first night passed uneventfully, though I could feel the silence pressing down like a weight. Besides a few crickets, no animals stirred, even the frogs and the nightbirds held their tongues. I lay in my tent, listening to the stillness, straining for any sound that might betray the presence of some predator, or worse. The darkness remained quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind stirred the trees. By dawn, the rising sun burned away the mist, and with it, my apprehension. I laughed at myself as I brewed a cup of tea over the campfire, the light of day making my fears seem childish at most. "See?" I muttered to no one. "Just a story." I spent the day cataloguing the area, marking bird species, sketching the flora, and taking soil samples. The land was breathtaking in its own harsh way. Patchwork of golden grass, blackened trees, and still mirror water. The billabong itself shimmered in the sunlight, its surface so calm it could have been glass. Every so often, my eyes flickered to the water, half expecting to see something break the surface. A ripple, a shadow, but the billabong remained undisturbed. A serene and beautiful contradiction to the tales of terror I'd been told. When night fell again, I felt emboldened by the previous night's stillness. I even entertained myself by recording notes into my handheld recorder. "Second night at the billabong? No signs of any wildlife near the water's edge, which is strange, but it could be explained by environmental factors. Local legends persist about a creature, the Bunyip. But so far, no evidence of anything unusual. I'll keep watch for tonight and see if anything changes, eh?
The stars glittered overhead as I sat by the fire, the warmth on my face comforting against the cool night air. The stillness returned, but this time it didn't feel as oppressive. It felt peaceful. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I drifted off quickly, unbothered by the quiet. Nothing disturbed me that night. No cries in the dark, no eerie splashes from the water, just the sound of my own breath and the gentle whisper of the wind stirred the trees. But when I woke up, the night told a different story. First thing I noticed was the cold. My fire had gone out, leaving only smouldering embers. The second was the eerie silence, but the third was the mess. My campsite, which I'd carefully arranged the day before, was in complete disarray. My tent, once stacked securely, and now it leaned precariously to one side. The poles snapped, as in wrenched apart by inhuman hands. My supplies were scattered, my notebook floating in the shallow edge of the billabong, my food tins ripped open and emptied. I froze, the blood draining from my face as I took it all in. Something had been here. "It's just animals, George," I whispered, more to convince myself than anything else. "A dingo, or maybe a wild boar." But the tracks told a different story. I crouched near the edge of the campsite where the dirt was soft and damp from the night's dew. There were paw prints, no hoof marks, just deep circular impressions, too large to belong to anything I'd seen before. The ground was clawed, as if something massive had dragged itself through the area. The billabong caught my eye then. The once pristine water was disturbed, ripples lapping gently against the shore despite the utter stillness of the morning air. My stomach twisted as I remembered the guide's words. "Doesn't just kill you, mate, it keeps you." I snatched my notebook from the water, shaking off the droplets and flipping through the pages. Most of my sketches and notes were intact, though the edges of the paper were wrinkled and damp. My recorder, thankfully, had been left untouched on the far side of the campsite. Grabbing it, I hit the record button, my voice trembling as I spoke. "Morning of the third day. Wake to find the campsite in complete disarray. Supplies scattered, tent damaged, tracks leading towards the billabong. Tracks I can't identify. The water, it's moving, but there's no wind. No explanation yet. I'm beginning to think the man's old stories weren't just stories." I looked around, half expecting to see him, lurking in the trees, watching to see if I'd learnt my lesson, but the forest was empty, the quiet more oppressive than ever. Despite my growing unease, I forced myself to stay. I was here to document the truth, not to run, not at the first sign of trouble. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The day passed uneventfully, but the unease lingered like a shadow. I bruised myself with repairs patching the tent and reorganising what little I could salvage of my supplies. The sun climbed higher, its warmth doing little to chase away the cold knot of fear lodged in my chest. The tracks near the billabong haunted me, circular, deep and clawed, like nothing I'd seen before in my years of field work. I sketched them carefully in my notebook, noting their size and spacing, but no amount of analysis could make sense of them. By late afternoon the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint, swampy stench of decay. I paused, glancing towards the water. It lay still and calm, reflecting the pale blue sky, but the ripples from earlier that morning hadn't left my mind at all. As evening fell, the shadows stretched long and thin across the ground, and the gum trees began to sway gently, their branches creaking like tired bones. I set another fire, larger this time, and sat close to it as the chill crept back into the air.
That was when the noises began. At first it was subtle. A faint splash from the billabong, soft enough to dismiss as a fish or a frog. But then came the rustling, low and deliberate, from the underbrush, just beyond the fire's reach. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. The forest was a tangle of shadows and muted colours. No sign of whatever had made the sound. Animals, George, I muttered under my breath. It's just animals. But the rustling came again, this time closer, accompanied by the faintest growl, a deep guttural sound that sent a shiver racing down my spine. I stood gripping the long branch I'd been using to stoke the fire. Who's there? I called, my voice shaking. The only response was silence. Minutes passed as the fire crackled and the wind whispered through the trees. I forced myself to sit down, telling myself I was imagining things, that fear was playing tricks on me. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. A low, hulking form that slipped through the underbrush near the water's edge. It was there and gone in an instant. So quick I almost convinced myself I hadn't seen it at all. Almost. The billabong rippled again, this time more violently, as though something large had slid into its depths. I reached for my recorder with trembling hands, hitting the button to document what I could. Evening of the third day. Something's out there. I can't explain it. Shadows near the water, noises near the brush. It's watching me. I can feel it. The billabong, it's not normal. I should leave, but... I trailed off, staring at the dark shimmering surface of the water. A small part of me wanted to pack up and run, but the rest of me, the part that sought answers and proof, refused to leave without seeing it for myself. The fire hissed as the wind shifted, carrying it with it a low guttural sound that seemed to echo from the billabong itself. It doesn't just kill you, mate. It keeps you. The guide's words returned, unbidden as I stared into the darkness. And then, far across the water, two faint, glowing orbs appeared, low to the ground. Too far apart to be a bird's eyes, they hovered there, unmoving, as if waiting for me to make the first move. I didn't blink. I couldn't. Whatever it was, it had seen me too. My instincts finally overtook my curiosity, and I backed away from the fire, my eyes fixed on those glowing orbs across the water. They didn't move, but their presence pinned me in place. A predator's gaze locked onto its prey. My heart pounded as I scrambled to gather what supplies I could, shoving them into my pack with shaking hands. I didn't bother dismantling the tent, I just ran. The bush swallowed me whole, the undergrowth clawing at my legs and branches snagging onto my shirt as I stumbled through the darkness. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from the billabong, from whatever was waiting in its depths. The night seemed alive around me, the wind carrying faint whispers of the occasional low growl that seemed to follow in my wake. I tripped over a root and hit the ground hard, my palms scraping against the dirt. For a moment I lay there panting and trembling before dragging myself to my feet and pressing on. Then, through the trees I saw it, a dim light flickering in the distance. My breath caught in my throat as I pushed towards it, boots crushing in the underbrush. The light belonged to a small cabin, its walls weathered and grey, the roof patched with rusted sheets of tin. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and a faint scent of wood smoke and something earthy filled the air. I stumbled to the door and knocked frantically. It opened almost immediately, revealing an old Aboriginal man with a lined face and piercing eyes that seemed to see straight through me. He was wrapped in a threadbare blanket, a wooden walking stick in one hand. "You're running from it," he said without even knowing why I was there, the voice low and grave. "Come in, me name's Mick." I didn't argue. I stepped inside, the warmth of the cabin a stark contrast to the chill outside. The interior was simple, but cluttered. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling, and shelves lined with jars and trinkets filled the space. A small fire crackled in the corner, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Mick gestured for me to sit at the table, and I sank into a rickety chair, my breath still uneven. "The billabong," I blurted, the words tumbling out. Something's there. My camp, it was trashed. Tracks in the dirt, and these eyes glowing across the water." Mick held up a hand, silencing me. "You've been marked." I frowned, my heart sinking. "Marked? What does that mean?" Mick sighed heavily and sat across from me, his walking stick resting against the table. "The Bunyip, it knows you now. It's watched you, touched your world. You should leave tonight, if you can, and don't come back." I shook my head in frustration mingled with fear. "It's just a legend. A story to scare people. There has to be an explanation." "There is," he interrupted sharply, his eyes narrowing. "The explanation is that the Bunyip is real, and once it marks you, it won't stop until it has you." I swallowed hard, Mick's words sinking in like stones. "But why me?" "Because you were there," he said simply. "The billabong is its domain, and you disturbed it. It doesn't care who you are or why you're there. All it knows is that you don't belong." I stared at him, my mind racing. "So what do I do? How do I stop it?" "You don't," he said firmly. "You leave. You never come back. That's your only chance." Mick's words settled over me like a death sentence, but even as fear clawed at me, a stubborn part of me refused to accept it. I glanced at the door and back at him. "And if I don't leave?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Then it will take you, and no one will ever find you." Mick's words lingered in the air, heavy and foreboding, but as I sat there, staring at the firelight dancing across the walls, a thought struck me, a spark of defiance amid the fear. "Proof." I leaned forward, gripping the edge of my table. "It leaves tracks," I began, my voice trembling but steady enough to push through. "I saw them. Massive circular prints. If I go back and document them, get photographs, casts, I could prove it exists. People would pay to know about this thing." The old man's eyes narrowed, his expression darkening. "You're a fool if you think your money is worth risking your life, mate. You don't understand what you're dealing with." "But that's just it," I pressed, my heart pounding now, not from fear, but from excitement. "No one understands it. That's why this thing is so important. Think about it, a real, living piece of folklore. It's history, science, and legend all wrapped up into one. If I can bring back evidence, I'll be the one who proved it. You'll be the one it takes," he snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "It won't let you walk away with proof. The Bunyip doesn't like being seen, let alone exposed. If you go back there, you'll be playing right into its hands, or claws, whatever it has. You think you're clever, but you're just another fool who won't listen until it's too late." Mick's words gave me pause, but the idea had already taken root. Proof meant fame, recognition, money, everything I'd ever wanted. And besides, I'd be careful, and I wouldn't stay too long. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Thank you for the shelter," I said, trying to sound confident, even as my pulse raced. "But I can't just walk away from this. I'll be careful. I'll be quick. I just need to get back to the billabong, document the prints and leave." Mick rose slowly, his expression one of weary resignation. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice low and grave. "But if you're determined to go, take this." He turned to a shelf and pulled down a small bundle of twigs tied together with string, handing it to me. "A protection charm. It won't stop the Bunyip, but it might buy you time if it comes to it." I hesitated and then took it, the rough twigs pricking against my palm. "Thank you," I said softly. "Don't thank me," he replied. "Pray you won't need it." As I left the cabin and made my way back into the bush, the moonlight barely illuminating the path, the excitement of potential discovery warred with the gnawing dread that had taken root in my gut. The old man's warnings echoed in my mind, but I pushed them aside, Proof was out there, waiting by the billabong. And I was going to get it. The journey back to the billabong was eerily silent, the usual rustle of nocturnal animals absent, as if the entire bush was holding its breath. The charm the old man had given me dangled from my belt, its rough texture brushing against my leg with every step. I clung to it like a lifeline, even as doubt crept in. By the time I reached the billabong, the moon hung high in the sky, its pale light casting the water in an otherworldly glow. I stepped cautiously through the underbrush, my heart pounding as the billabong came into view. And then I stepped dead in my tracks. The entire campsite, tent, supplies, everything was gone. At first, I thought it had been stolen or scattered further into the bush, but then I saw it. There, on a small island in the middle of the billabong, my belongings were piled haphazardly. The tent's poles jutted at odd angles, and my gear was strewn across the uneven ground like a grotesque offering. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was no way anyone or anything could have moved everything without leaving signs of a struggle. My eyes scanned the water, searching for any sign of movement, but the surface was still and glassy, reflecting the moon like a mirror. And then I saw them, the tracks. They lined the muddy edge of the billabong, deep and clawed, much larger than the ones I'd seen before. Whatever had made them had dragged my entire campsite across the water. I crouched down, pulling out my notebook and sketching the prints as quickly as my trembling hands would allow. The details were unmistakable. Round pads, long claws, a size that dwarfed any known animal. But I needed more. I needed moulds, measurements. My plaster kit was in the pile on the island. I stared at the water, its surface deceptively calm, and then at the landmass where my equipment sat like a prize waiting to be claimed. No, I muttered to myself, shaking my head. This is insane. But the idea of walking away empty-handed, of leaving this discovery incomplete, was unbearable. Fame, fortune and validation were just a few metres away. I glanced at the charm on my belt, its rough twigs catching the moonlight. The old man's warnings echoed in my mind once again. It won't stop the Bunyip, but it might buy you some time. Steeling myself, I stepped closer to the water's edge, my boots sinking into the mud. The island wasn't far. If I moved quickly, I could retrieve the kit, document the prints, and leave before anything happened. I just had to hope I wasn't already too late. I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was watching me, lurking just beneath the surface of the water. The calmness of the billabong felt like a trap, the stillness betraying the tension in the air. I hesitated, only for a moment before I made my decision. I couldn't leave without that proof. I waded into the water, the cold chill of it seeping into my boots, the mud clinging to my legs. The billabong was deeper than I expected. As I swam, the water seemed to rise up to my chest, and the feeling of something below me stirred an unease deep in my bones. My eyes darted around trying to make sense of every ripple in the water. A shadow moved beneath me. I stopped, my heart racing, my breath catching in my throat. There was no breeze, no reason for the water to shift. Another ripple. Closer this time. I quickly pressed on, forcing myself to ignore the feeling that something monstrous was moving just out of my sight. My eyes flickered to the island ahead. My gear was almost within reach. I kicked harder, pushing through the water despite the panic creeping into my chest. The shadow moved again, just below the surface, too quick for me to pinpoint, and then a sharp, sudden movement. The water around me erupted in a splash. I froze, nearly swallowing a scream as something massive brushed against my leg. The water churned violently, pulling at me. The sensation was more than just a brush. It was a tug, an attempt to drag me under. I pulled the charm from my waistband, waving it and jerking it towards the water, which seemed to make the pull on my legs stop. Then I tossed the charm in its direction, hoping it would drive the creature away further. My heart hammered in my chest as I kicked desperately, forcing myself forward with everything I had. I reached the island just as something dark and slick rose from its depths, its form barely visible in the moonlight. It was large, larger than any creature I could have imagined, and the water rippled around it like a living thing. I scrambled up the slippery rocks at the edge of the island, dragging myself onto solid ground. My chest burned, but I didn't dare stop to catch my breath. I darted to the centre of the island where my gear was scattered across the ground. I grabbed my plaster kit, but as I turned to head for the tree on the far side of the island, the water around the island had shifted again, and the dark shape beneath the surface was circling the landmass. Its eyes, those glowing eyes, were locked onto me from the depths, unblinking, knowing. My mind raced. I needed to get to higher ground. I looked up at the nearest tree, a tall, sturdy gum, and made a dash for it. My breath ragged. I climbed quickly, every moment desperate. My fingers scraped against the rough bark, but I didn't care. When I reached the branch high enough, I stopped, gasping for air. My heart thundering in my chest, I looked down and that's when I saw it. The Bunyip. The creature's head emerged from the water, its massive amphibious form barely fitting beneath the surface. It was dark, slick, its body a twisted blend of reptilian and mammalian features, with eyes that burned like coals. It watched me from the edge of the water, its mouth slowly opening in what seemed like a silent growl. The creature's large clawed hands reached towards the tree. Its arms were strong, thick with muscle, but when it tried to climb the tree trunk, it faltered. It wasn't built for climbing. It growled in frustration, its body withering and shifting as it pulled back into the water. I held my breath, not daring to move. The creature circled the island again, its presence undeniable, but it didn't seem able to reach me. Still, the fear remained. An overwhelming, suffocating certainty that if I moved, I'd be torn apart. I could hear the Bunyip's growls grow fainter as it retreated back into the depths, but I knew it wasn't leaving. It was patient. It would wait. I sat in the tree, staring out at the water, the shadows of the billabong stretching under the moonlight. The Bunyip was there, somewhere beneath the surface, always watching. The night passed slowly, the chill of the air seeping through the branches of the tree and biting at my skin. My eyes refused to close for long. Every time I blinked, I imagined the Bunyip's glowing eyes staring back at me from the water. But the hours dragged on, and eventually, the creature seemed to lose interest. The growls and splashes that had plagued me throughout the night faded, and the only sound that was left was the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I stayed in the tree, my muscles aching, my mind running through every possibility. Every once in a while I'd glance down at the billabong, still and silent, as if nothing had happened at all. I wondered if I had dreamed it all up, or if I was just a heartbeat away from being dragged under. My eyes got heavy and the temperature was cold without a fire, but I guess the cold was helping to keep me awake. Suddenly the water stirred, as two glowing red eyes rose to the surface, staring unblinking at me. That thing, that scary, menacing thing, was leaving the water and walking towards the tree once more. I broke down a branch and screamed, "Leave me alone, you bloody monster!" But the Bunyip didn't care that I had armed myself. It wanted me. It wanted to keep me. But to my disbelief, the Bunyip kept ascending the tree. I took a swing at it and missed, growled and screeched at me in defiance. The Bunyip inched higher up the tree, getting closer to my feet. I swung at it again, this time connecting with the creature's head as the branch snapped across its face. The creature fell and returned to the water once more, whimpering as it ran. I took a deep breath and laughed. "Ha! Take that, Human 1, Terrifying Bunyip 0! I shouted towards the water. I wiped my brow as I sat back in the tree, vigilant of the water, waiting for any sign of its return, but the rest of the night was dead quiet. So much, in fact, that I even dared to fall asleep. But as dawn began to break, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, I heard a sound that made my heart leap as I awoke. Footsteps crunching through the underbrush. I leaned forward in the tree, straining to see. And then, emerging from the bush, was the old guide, John Owen. He was followed by his dog, a large shaggy beast that bounded ahead of him, nose to the ground, the man's eyes locked onto mine and his face softened with a hint of relief. "You shouldn't have stayed here, Georgie. It's not safe," he said, his voice low and steady as if he'd expected this. I felt my legs shake with exhaustion as I descended from the tree. My feet touched the ground, but I couldn't stand without a moment of support. The dog came over, sniffing me curiously, and the guide placed a steady hand on my shoulder. "I told you it'd be bad," John murmured, "but I'm not surprised you had to see it for yourself. You're just lucky I spotted your tent, mate." I didn't speak, too tired to explain my obsession with proving the creature's existence, too shaken from words. John didn't seem to need an explanation, he simply just gestured for me to follow. We made our way back to shore on a small raft with paddles, the dog trotting ahead, its ears perked. As we reached the edge of the water, I froze, my heart sank as I looked down at the ground. The tracks, the massive clawed prints were gone. In their place, the earth was trampled, scattered with heavy footprints of the guide's boots and the dog's paws. The marks that had once seemed so fresh, so undeniably real, had been obliterated, buried under the weight of the guide's passage. My stomach churned as I stared at the ground, the realisation setting in like a lead weight. The Bunyip, the creature I'd risked everything to find, was nowhere to be seen. There were no fresh prints, no sign of its presence. It was as though it had vanished into thin air, perhaps a figment of my imagination, or something far worse. "It's better that way," John said quietly, his voice full of strange sadness. "Sometimes it's better people don't go looking for it." I nodded numbly, my throat tight. The world felt like it was spinning out of control, a reminder that there are some things too dangerous to chase, some mysteries that are meant to stay buried. As I followed John away from the billabong, the Bunyip's legend fading with each step, I couldn't shake the feeling that some things are better left unseen. It comes in the night, up from the billabong, with red eyes that seek you. It comes up from the billabong, and when it takes you, it keeps you.
Well, that was surely an interesting story. You know, there's a moral to be learned in almost every book, in almost every story. You just have to be looking. Or perhaps you shouldn't be looking, as the story's example may set for you. If you enjoyed this story, give it a like and share, and be sure to hit that subscribe button. Thanks everybody. This has been the Pages of Darkness.